This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Big Screen. I am excited once again to be joined by Erik Fogg of the Reconsidered podcast and unofficial and official co-host of Beyond the Big Screen. We've talked about so many movies, and we have a really special one today. It's unexpectedly special because we are talking about the book and the movie No Country for Old Men. And as of this recording, Cormac McCarthy passed yesterday or the day before. I think it was yesterday. Erik, how are you? And I can't even remember how we came up with this picking No Country for Old Men, but I feel like it fits in perfectly, even though it's not sci-fi, but it fits in perfectly with a lot of the themes that we've been talking about.
I think that might have been why. Boy, I'm touched to be an unofficial co-host. I like it. I'm in. And I think when we were talking about it, dear listeners, the more we get into this, the more we angst about what we're going to do next, because we don't want to just keep doing the same thing at you guys. It's like, oh, what if we do yet another, cyberpunk sci-fi thriller? And then we think, maybe we should do something different. And I looked at my, I forget which one of us proposed it. I think it might have been me because we did Looper last time. And, but I looked at my list of I have a list of my favorite movies ever. This is on it. And I think one of the major reasons we picked it, I maybe just threw out this first. I had some backups ready, but I think the major reason I threw this out was that I like my movies dark, and I also like movies that explore the human spirit a lot, which is a big part of why I like sci-fi so much, because that's kind of the point when it's done well. And I think also maybe the subconscious reason is I had recently read The Dog Stars by I forget who, but if you look up The Dog Stars, you'll find a great book about a few years after an apocalypse, in which people are just trying to get by. And it reminded me of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And so I was thinking a lot about The Road, and that may have been the reason I picked No Country for Old Men. So there's my best guess.
It is really amazing. This is, I think, one of the best novels turned into a movie of all times. It really, I think as much as you can possibly get, it got the gist of what the book was getting. The book got into a more depth in certain areas, and I think they took the movie in a couple of slight different places. But I would say of any movie I've ever seen, this is as close as watching it versus reading.
Yeah, it was very nearly a frame for frame replay of the book, which is surprisingly daring. One of the nice things is the book is pretty short. And one of the reasons the book is pretty short is there's only so much to tell, right? There's only so much going on. The Road is the same way. It's very Cormac McCarthy-esque, where he's like, I'm just going to tell you what's going on, and then it's over. We're done. We're moving on. And, and that is true both of the scene and of the story. And I like that about him quite a bit. And what's interesting is this is wildly different from other storytellers I like, such as Stanley Kubrick, who is like, we're going to linger on this scene as long as I can get away with. So I don't know if I have a type in that sense, but yeah, the Coen brothers decided, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to go basically frame for frame in every, at every possible opportunity. And what's cool about that is as the Coen brothers, you get this opportunity to say, okay, we read this scene, we're going to sit down, we're going to read this scene again. How are we going to bring this to life? How are we going to make this as like beautifully, awesomely, terribly real as we can? Because let me tell you, while McCarthy writes in a very simple way, if you've ever read the book On Writing by Stephen King says in On Writing that you should write pretty simply, in particular in fiction, if you want people's imaginations to really run with something and fill it in, right? So instead of like the door was slammed aggressively, leaving the basement door was slammed aggressively, leaving a echoing note of portent, that is a portent of doom, right? It's just the basement door closed. And like, that's enough in context of what's going on, if like the bad, it's Stephen King. So if the bad guy's locking you in the basement, I know I'm going on a tangent here, but if the bad guy's locking you in the basement and it's like the basement door closed, you're like, oh snap, this is bad, right? And that's more than enough to let your incredible meat machine in your skull fill in the rest. And so McCarthy, so these guys have this awesome challenge of taking this very rich book, a lot of very cool, very bloody, very awful scenes, right? Especially right out the gate when Chigurh decides, or when Chigurh, chokes a deputy to death with his handcuffs in order to escape. They decide, okay, we're going to take the scene and we're going to try to bring it to life in as real a way as possible with McCarthy's writing style, which leaves a lot for the imagination. And that's and as a book lover, it means that it's a little scary going into it because you're like, oh, have they messed with it, right? Or did they imagine it in a radically different way than I did? And it's both a testament to the Coen brothers and to McCarthy himself that when I watched it, I just felt like the movie that went on in my mind when I was reading No Country for Old Men was now playing in front of my eyes when I watched No Country for Old Men. It was very cool to see.
I'm always interested to hear, did you watch the movie first and then read the novel, or novel then movie?
I happened to read the novel first and then the movie. It wasn't on principle, although sometimes it is. It just happened to shake out that way. And I think it's because I read The Road before. Don't hold me to why. But sometimes I do that on purpose. This time it was by accident. What about you?
I had watched the movie first and then read the novel, and I felt, and usually I'm like you, I'm not a purist of one way or the other generally, but it just so happened I watched the movie first and then read the novel, and I really did feel that the novel sort of just filled in some of the cracks a little bit. But otherwise, it really did. The Coen brothers, I like that first scene that you mentioned where the deputy is strangled by Chigurh, and some of the things that you had to imagine, but they put it on the screen, like Chigurh's face. It lays out so pure of how evil this character is. And I almost think we're going to, in the future, call that Cormac McCarthy character of this just person who is pure evil.
Yeah, actually, let's get into Chigurh right now, because he's obviously like the most interesting character by far. Although rather interesting is almost the wrong word for him. He's the most compelling. He's an incredibly compelling character, even though he is in a lot of ways not in the least interesting, because there's not much going on up there. Right. And I don't mean he's dumb. He's quite smart, but there's absolutely 0.0 growth for him. Right. Yeah. He does not grow. He refuses to grow. He has no interest in growing. He does not want to change at all. He is a force of nature. He is he is a herald of something much worse to come in the future. Right. And that even before Sheriff Bell tells us that's what's going on. But you can tell this guy, he's a little bit like, I don't know. I just reread the opening to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Zarathustra describes himself as a herald for the overman, right? He's a heavy raindrop heralding the lightning. And Chigurh is in a similar way. He's a herald. He is a harbinger. He is a warrior. He's not even a warning, because a warning implies that there's something you can do about it. He's telling you that this is the future just by being. And one of the cool things, you can see it in the way that Chigurh's face twists and contorts when he is doing that. When he's strangling the deputy to death, the really horrifying thing about him is that, and I think the thing that makes it clear that he's so perfectly embodying evil is that I think like most people, you see anger, right? Like when Palpatine is trying to kill Skywalker, you see anger in his face because he's pissed off that he wasn't able to turn Skywalker, right? Or other things like that. You see these emotions in people's face where they're like being highly reactive to, the person that they're interacting with. And Chigurh does not care at all, right? He's struggling physically, and that's it. And at that moment, like we are dealing with a very different creature here.
As Chigurh, one of the fantastic things about his character is they give us absolutely no context for him whatsoever. We just have to, again, we paint a picture in our minds that maybe he's Mexican, he's foreign of some sort, maybe. And then you start to paint in your mind, well, was he an assassin before? Was he in the cartels? A total blank slate. And what I thought, and I wonder what you think of this, is normally when I read a novel, I'm trying to look at, are they trying to show conflicts between characters or parallels? And I think in this book, they're all just their own thing.
Interesting. Actually, yeah. I didn't think that deeply about it, but you're right. And they have interaction points. Obviously Llewellyn and Chigurh are the main two interaction points. And in a way they have conflict, but they're often obviously in the most conventional sense, right? If you're a freshman in literary 101 class, they have conflict, right?
Yeah.
Llewellyn has money. Chigurh wants money. Chigurh says, give me money and I'll only kill you. And Llewellyn says, I'm going to try to get rid of this money and not die. Thank you. And that's kind of the crux. That's the crux of the novel. That's the main point of the novel is that, the movie is that, and for those who, obviously spoilers abound here, but Llewellyn gets himself in trouble by like going back to the scene of the crime where he stole the money in order to like help this guy who's dying. And, because he is, he has avarice that we all have, right? Llewellyn is like very normal, right? And that's what makes Llewellyn such a great character, is he is the most us of anybody. He's the most normal of all of us. Like if you see a bag full of $2 million, you'll probably take it. And then you'll probably have a lot of weird feelings about it afterwards. We're like, holy smokes, wait a minute. And then you'll probably do some dumb stuff afterward. And he does a lot of dumb reactive stuff that's entirely understandable because he's this like wonderful mix of kind of like normal good, like he's a good guy like most of us, and he, and it's not evil for him to take the drug money, right? We don't see it being morally awful of him. It's like it's a drug deal gone wrong. Everybody died. It's this is all bad money anyway. Should he have turned it in? I mean, kind of, but like the rest of us kind of go like, look, if you find a bag with $2 million, you can turn it in. I don't know. Anyway, point being, he is coming up against Chigurh, and yeah, to say they have a conflict is a little bit like you or me having a conflict with a tornado. Like, we're not really having a conflict with the tornado. The tornado is us up, and we can either like be smart enough to avoid getting up by the tornado, or we can be, a little too gutsy and the tornado gets us.
Yeah, exactly. We know that we shouldn't drive into the tornado, and Llewellyn Moss knows that he shouldn't fly into the tornado. In the movie, this was a thing that you had mentioned in our discussion and through our planning process, that in the movie they try to maybe set up Llewellyn as almost something approaching an anti-Chigurh, but he really isn't. He isn't the anti-Chigurh. He's just like you said, he's a good old boy. He was in the army. He's probably has more skills than I certainly would have of evading the cartels or getting shot and that sort of thing. But he has human emotions. He feels bad for that guy who's dying in the middle of the desert. And so he goes back, and that really is the thing that ultimately completely screws him. But in the book, they don't really show that. They really show him as someone who is just, he made a decision. He knew that he was making a very risky decision for a big reward, but not that in any way that he was going to be someone who could in some way challenge Chigurh. Yeah, what did you think about Llewellyn Moss's character?
Yeah, I think Llewellyn is like he's the one character that I don't love how the Coen brothers portrayed him, because I found him a little more like in the book, he's a little more like folksy and normal. I understand and would even defend the decision to anyone who like came at the Coen brothers too hard. And I think the way I would defend it is by saying, for someone to have witnessed Chigurh and then decide, you know what, I'm going to take this guy on, rather than what I'm going to do is I'm going to take me and my entire family to the police station and say, lock us in your like tightest air sealed chamber until this guy is gone. Right. Because like it's what you or I would do. Right. This is where what you or I would do now ends and what Llewellyn would do begins. And so, making him a little bit tough, I think helps make that believable in a way that, especially for like a slightly more modern movie, in a way that I think McCarthy's concept that like the American man is willing to just take matters into his own hands is like a theme of his. And I think it may be, McCarthy died at 89 this year. And so, the guy was born in the 30s and he's from a different time where I think like, I'm just going to take matters into my own hands feels more normal to him. Whereas I think we need to like the Coen brothers, like we need to suit this guy up a little bit more in order to make it a little more believable that he's going to take matters into his own hands, even though it's crazy, right? Like, even though you're doing it against a guy who like carries around, like Chigurh has, like you see these shots where like on Chigurh's belt is the pneumatic gun that's used to kill cattle, right? By like popping him in the back of the head. And you're like, holy crap, this guy's crazy. And so that's my defense of them souping him up a little bit and having Josh Brolin, like with his like snarling face, be like, arr, as opposed to just like, and which is like, I always kind of figured Llewellyn was kind of like, oh crap, like running around, mostly with an oh crap look on his face the entire book. And so I think that's my take of how they did it. And I if we look at like both the book and the movie and how they chose to treat him, the guy is like, you watch him make some decisions and you got some like bulging eyeballs, almost like a horror movie, but not quite so dumb. Where like, but I think most of those, what I think is so beautiful about the story and Llewellyn is that most of those decisions that doom him are like made early on, and then everything else he's just reacting. And it's like kind of at some point it's kind of too late. And much like getting blackmailed, like you're already in too deep and you're just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And at some point he's making like in some ways entirely rational decisions, even if they're not the best ones. And again, he always could just like go to the cops, like take, what's his wife's name? Carla Jean. He always could just take Carla Jean and be like, hey cops, I up real bad. Like put me in a hermetically sealed room, please. And because I'm gonna die. And but like the $2 million is like just tempting enough. Although never mind, he's trying to give it back at some point. His pride gets in the way, and it's what gets him killed. And that portrayal by the Coen brothers of a guy who, because of his past and because of his like sense of his kind of you see like his sense of his masculinity wrapped up in his pride. And like not wanting to kind of give in and go over to the cops. You see that as a major driver, and I think it's very important to his character and therefore driving the narrative.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors. The two characters that really... really the only other characters besides Carla Jean, his wife, who really is just I think she's more set up as a foil to show that he can never be entirely, I guess, he can't entirely be like Chigurh because he has these connections. Whatever decisions he makes have to take her into account. And he even, like, he's cut that to the bone as much as you can possibly do. He doesn't really care about Carla Jean's mother if she gets caught up. In the book, they say that he knows that his brother is probably going to get a visit because they'll see the VIN off of his truck. They're going to put it back to Moss, and then they're going to know everything about Moss 5 minutes after the county courthouse opens. But he has that one thing that's always going to be the thing that will trip him up from really being as cold-blooded as Chigurh.
Yeah. And however, she's not just what's so interesting, and I'm sort of processing this live. What's so interesting is you think, as soon as Chigurh says, the final decision that he has to make is when Chigurh says, give me the money and I'll just kill you. If you don't give me the money, I'm going to kill you and your wife. And, and you can understand someone going, I'd like to roll the dice and have neither of us die and try to do that. You can understand that. But you can also look at that and go like, look, dude, you have gotten, like, this guy you have seen enough of this guy. You've seen enough of Chigurh to know that you are way out of your league. You've already lost. His unwillingness to admit that he's lost and to accept his own fate and death for his wife, right? That's like another one of his, his sort of like, I guess, deadly sins that comes up where he goes like, no, I want to keep rolling the dice and I'm willing to roll the dice with her as well. And that's where, like, what's interesting is that's where, maybe he could have gone as cold-blooded as Chigurh, because it's like, look, she's on his chopping block. If I want to save us both, I need to be willing to do anything. And he wasn't. And that's kind of the problem. He kind of like makes half measures the whole way and isn't willing to accept that he's either got to go he's an army vet, right? He doesn't lack skills. He either has to go all in and like sacrifice his humanity and cause a lot of collateral damage, and like blow up a building with Chigurh in it, right? And like hopefully get Chigurh, and get a lot of other people too, or give up himself. And he's not willing to do either of those. And so he loses everything, including his family. And, that's where you see like his role in this tragedy. So, he's a frustrating character. And that's part of what makes it such a delightful book is that, you think of like, Chigurh is just like, he's like Darth Vader or what's another, the Terminator, in a lot of ways. Although it's so interesting about Chigurh is that like he negotiates because he's got this like weird code, right? It's what makes him such a great psychopath. He's like not angry. He's not greedy. He doesn't even want the money. It's not for him. It's a job, right? And, and he's just going to do it. And it's because Chigurh is following. He's so committed to this code, much like a samurai or some other warrior, but like twisted in this super dark way. And I think this is something else that Llewellyn doesn't really appreciate about him, that when Chigurh says, I will kill your wife, it's possible Llewellyn doesn't believe him. And clearly Carla Jean at the end thinks she can negotiate her way out of it. Now, she doesn't get to know Chigurh as well as Llewellyn does, but like the place where you really see who this guy is deep down is at the end, after he's killed Llewellyn, after he's got the money back, after everything else is wrapped up. The only loose end he feels he needs to deal with is he has to go kill Carla Jean. Why? Because he already said he would. That's it. That's it. Like, he doesn't need anything from her death. He doesn't get anything from her death. His life would be made much easier if he just went to Tahiti and like had some margaritas. But because he'd made the offer to Llewellyn and said, look, either turn yourself in with the money and I'll kill you, or I'll kill your wife, even though, right, that's the kind of thing, it's a deterrent, and there's like no rational reason for him to follow through on that now that Llewellyn's dead. because like it's not going to affect his reputation anyway, right? Like if you think of the game theory, it's all irrelevant. It's because he follows this twisted code. And the twist to the twisted code is he's like willing to let a coin flip, also operate. And I've not quite put this together quite how he works, and I've not like looked up a psychiatrist or a psychologist's review of who he is. But at some point, when she's begging, he's like willing to negotiate with her, and the way he's willing to negotiate is say, okay, let's let fate decide. And he flips a coin, and then he's like, oh, sorry, it didn't come up your way, blammo, right? And down she goes, and that was it. And you just felt like he had to do it. And you get this theme about choice where that I'm now talking about, where like Llewellyn makes all these choices and he suffers the consequences of them, and Chigurh at least believes. And he might be crazy enough that this is kind of like he's just pre-programmed. Chigurh seems to believe he's not making choices, right? He's operating, right? He's seeing the situation, he's reacting to it, but none of this is his choice, right? He's like sent along as an agent to get this money, and he's doing what's necessary, and then and he leaves it to Llewellyn to make the choice over whether to put his wife at risk or not. Llewellyn makes the choice, and now Chigurh feels like he has to follow through.
Even that Woody Harrelson's character, Carson Wells, he's a pretty small part of it, but he's also mixed up in this. He's an international hitman who knows Chigurh for years back, and even he doesn't, in the end, really believe that Chigurh is as evil as Wells actually knows he is. He still debates with him, you don't have to do this. And he knows Chigurh better than anybody else in the story. And he still can't believe that Chigurh is actually who he is.
Yeah, it's a great point. There is, now that we're talking about it, denial is such a big part of this story, right? And the person who's not in denial, there's two people not in denial about what's going on. One of them's Chigurh, and one of them's Sheriff Ed Tom Bell.
Yeah.
Right. Sheriff Bell is looking at this being like, this is ugly and awful and way too big for me. And his way of dealing with reality is checking out. Right. And, and you have this story about, and McCarthy loves doing this. He has this like parallel to the past. Bell's way of dealing with the horror of reality is going, this is too much for me, I'm leaving. Like he did with the mortar shell that tore apart his squad in 1940 or whatever it was. It couldn't have been 40, but the 40s, yeah. It was a German mortar shell, mid 40s. And, and in seeing, and what's interesting is like, he's mostly just a spectator throughout all this, because Chigurh is at least 4 steps ahead of him the entire time. And they're just like, you feel bad for him because like he's like ineffectual and kind of pathetic, and not pathetic. I mean, he's clearly smart, but Chigurh is just better. He's a small town sheriff, and he's dealing with big time superhuman, inhuman level like assassin craziness. And and he looks at it, he goes like, this is too much for me, I gotta jet. And so he's in touch with reality. Chigurh is in touch with reality. He just chooses to deal with it in a way that the rest of us can't process. And and the fact that everyone else is in denial is like part of why they die. Right. So, Carson Wells should have never gotten wrapped up in this. Right. Like, he knows who Chigurh is. He should have he obviously got sent there with like a job, but just contain your ambitions, man, and know who you're dealing with. Llewellyn, same thing, et cetera, and everyone. Yeah, it's basically everyone at the end of all 3 of these like named characters who we hear talking about who are at the wrong end of Chigurh's gun, just can't believe that he's doing it, and but of course he is, because he's not. He's clearly depicted as not completely human. He's clearly depicted as just this machine.
Sheriff Bell, I think he's such an interesting character because he understands where he is in time. He talks about the old timers who lived on the frontier, his uncles and his grandparents and the sheriffs of past who had to fight with the Comanches and fight with the Mexicans. Like, their life was as brutal as anything. Then he lives in this kind of unusually peaceful time, and now he sees that they're going back to violence that probably will eclipse even what his grandparents are. And I think he knows he wasn't cut of the cloth to be like his parents and his grandparents were, and he's definitely not cut of the cloth to be in this new phase either. Like, he really is. It's a No Country for Old Men, but it's a No Country for people of his generation, really.
Yeah.
Like, even the other sheriffs don't really comprehend of like the violence that there is right next to them.
Yeah. What's interesting is, like, the fact that he served in the war. I think we tend to think of that sort of like greatest generation as tougher than the generations that came after. The greatest generation is tougher than the boomers, tougher than the X, millennials, Z, all those guys. And he certainly thinks of himself as way less tough than his parents, and he thinks of the times that are coming as more tough. And what's really interesting is this was written in 1980, and if we look at the curve of violence in the United States over time, so I'm just going to look this up right now. Murder in the United.
It took place in 1980, but I think it was
written in 2005.
Yeah.
Sorry. My bad. It took place in 1980. So he writes it for 1980, and and it is its peak. It's 1980 is the absolute peak of the murder rate in the United States. Now it's ticked back up a little bit since it bottomed out in like 2013, but it's like 10 per 100,000, and whereas in the 60s, it was only 5. So the United States had, in 15 years, gotten twice as violent, and it was on this uptrend. So it's written this time where you have a sense that things are going very much the wrong way, right? That the world around you is falling apart, that things are getting much, much worse. And that's got to be horrifying to watch unfold around you, especially when it's your job to try to stop it. And I don't know what to make of that, because it's such it's an odd time to write a Western movie. And by the way, I just realized that I knew the movie came out in 2007. I thought the book was written in like the 90s or something. But the Coen brothers must have like read this thing the day it came out and went, "Holy crap, we got to make a movie of this right now." Right? Because the movie came out 2 years after it was written, after it was published. Right, which is like blitzkrieg speed.
Yeah.
So they must have read it and were like, "We're making a movie this right away before anyone else can do it." So good for them. And so anyway, you have this 1980 is the year of the peak of the murder rate in the United States, and it's going up. So you have this sense from Bell that he was certainly sheriff during a softer, easier time. The world is changing around him, and Chigurh is just a what did I call him? A harbinger. A herald of that change. It turns out that change, that was sort of like the end of the change. It didn't reverse until the 90s, but that was sort of the end of that change, as opposed to the beginning of it. But for these characters, it feels like the beginning, right? It feels like things are just going to get worse from here on out. That's I think how Bell is experiencing that.
One of the other things is the setting of the book and the movie is I have heard criticism, or I read a couple of criticisms of the book when it just came out, and like, "Oh, this is just country people and their guns and this and that." This really isn't the country. This is the absolute middle of nowhere. Probably in the United States, it's one of the most far away from civilization. We went to Big Bend National Park, which is in that general vicinity. And I'm not kidding you. We drove for an hour and a half at 85 miles an hour and didn't see a single car going either with us or in the opposite direction. The first car that we actually saw was a state trooper who pulled us over, and I think it was just to check in and see if we were okay. Honestly, like if we weren't running from somebody, because it's the most desolate place, and you'll just hit these little towns, like the little town that Moss and his wife lived in, the Sheriff Bell. Like, this is so remote from anywhere. And things like I think, like you said, for Ed Tom, for the most part, you lived in basically on the moon. But as crime started to shift and cartels and the drugs, that suddenly became ground zero for something that went from nothing to probably one of the most violent places in the hemisphere.
God, McCarthy captures it so beautifully. It is kind of a shame. I did skim the book reviews, and they did seem to kind of miss the point. And it's part of the problem, not to get too folksy like farm boy on you here, but it is kind of the problem when you have a bunch of liberal arts journalist majors at the New York Times living in New York trying to write about a book written by a guy who grew up in the country about remote border America. Like, all these guys hear about the border, whatever. Anyway, point is, like, not a good person to be writing, right? And and nevertheless, what's so cool about this movie is it's so I don't want to say it's universal, because clearly it's the case that we have some people who missed the dang point, at least of the book, but it is so appealing. And maybe that's the question we need to ask, is, like, you and I are dancing around something that we talked about in prep and is in the notes. And this is possibly the hardest thing for me is, every other movie we've talked about, it's like there's this awesome theme and there's this big takeaway, and there's a message that the author is trying to tell us, or that the director is trying to tell us about humanity or something like that. And you have this outrageously popular movie, and Anton Chigurh, Javier Bardem, like, wins Best Supporting Actor for a great reason. He is absolutely horrifying. It turns out there's a survey of psychologists who widely agreed that Javier Bardem has the best acting of a psychopath in film history. So, like, it is a beautifully put together movie. It is a brilliantly acted movie. But what's the point, right? In some ways, it's like a series of things that happen, and, like, we see Chigurh as, we see Chigurh as this, like, embodiment of, like, evil and violence, and you kind of ask, like, why did McCarthy put him there? And I don't have a good answer, and that feels weird for me, because I'm such a such an armchair film critic, is I want to be able to say, like, oh, here's the point. And I don't know the point. And I don't know if anyone else, clearly the critics don't know the point. And yet this movie is outrageously popular. And that seems, like, hard to put together to me.
It really does. That between this and The Road, and I am reading Blood Meridian right now, one of McCarthy's other really most popular books. It's almost like a nihilism that this is bad. It's not going to be good. It's like a series of unfortunate events. Like, no matter what happens, we're never going to have a good, happy ending. And I think that he maybe wants us to just be comfortable with that's life. Sometimes there isn't the happy ending, and there isn't a bigger point to be drawn from it, because I really don't. I have a hard time drawing out what is the bigger point, besides he's just put these characters into basically impossible situations, and he just wants to see what they'll do.
Yeah. I mean, The Road feels very different to me, in part because, like, what do you see? You see this father's, and I forget everyone's name in The Road, but, like, you see this father's, like, tension between, like, the tenderness he's trying to show his son and the ruthlessness he's trying to show the world to protect his son and keep him alive. And, like, the little tiny moments of joy they find in this horror show of a world that they live in. And, you have this, like, irony at the end that the father's paranoia kept him from being able to, like, team up with people who then come and save the son at the end when the father dies. And, like, there's this, like, micro tragedy that the father dies not knowing if the son is going to be okay, but we know that the son is going to be okay when he's picked up by by this, like, other group of people who clearly have their act a little bit more together than this, like, struggling dad did, right? And so struggling dad here is, again, he reminds me a lot of Llewellyn and the way that McCarthy likes to write men is like they see a problem and they say, I'm going to take this into my own hands and I'm going to try to figure it out. And but like there's a point there where like, you know, where you see this heartbreakingly beautiful perseverance in this man who's like, you know, who's lost everything around him. And he's got a reason to live, which is to like keep his son alive so that maybe, you know, and like the walking down the road is to try to find essentially better weather, and they don't, and then he dies. But it doesn't feel as nihilist. It doesn't feel as like, I'm not left with the same kind of question mark of like, what was the point of all that? Because in No Country for Old Men, what happens? Well, everybody dies except maybe Chigurh, but maybe Chigurh is gonna die because he gets like up by that car crash, and he's like, you know, so wanted that he like drives off in bad shape, and we never hear from him again, and we just don't know what happened to him, you know, and we never will. And like part of the whole point of the book is leaving you so unsatisfied about everything, whereas like The Road leaves some like satisfaction. It has some like, you know, some themes of beauty. It has something, you know, it leaves you with like, I don't know, leaves you feeling something. It leaves you with like really bad feelings and really good feelings, and like and in a way that like No Country for Old Men, it almost left me without feelings. Like a bunch of stuff just happened, and I'm not even horrified at Chigurh's behavior because it's so inhuman. Again, it's a like, I'm horrified in the same way that I'm horrified when I see a tornado touchdown. You're like, oh God, these poor people, they got hit by a tornado. It stinks, but it doesn't hit the same as like when in The Road, the father comes across the human cattle or the human slavery basement, right? And like, you know, he's tempted for a minute to try to save them and has to run because the owners show up. And you're like, oh God, you know, like that, you know, it's so like, it's funny. You keep talking, and maybe the thing I'm stumbling into here is like, you talk about Chigurh as being like pure evil, but I don't have the revulsion for Chigurh, like the innate hatred for Chigurh that I do in The Road. Those characters who we never even see, we just hear them briefly, who are the owners, like the slavers who own these people in the basement. Like those people, like you want to strangle them. But Chigurh, like he needs to be dealt with, right? He's a problem, but he's so abstract. And that's like, you know, and like he's frightening, but a tornado is frightening. And I think that's what makes him such a masterwork. But like, I almost struggle with characterizing him as evil.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. That end scene, really, I think it shows that the only thing that can really take out Chigurh is fate.
Yeah.
Ed Tom with all the police and the call in the Texas Rangers, call in the FBI, whoever you want. Nobody is going to be able to give Chigurh his comeuppance except for a random car accident. Like that's all that I feel the same way that you never really hate Chigurh. You're terrified of him. It's very rare where you feel chilled from a character.
Yeah, Barton does such a good job being chilling. And especially because he has those like smiles every now and then, those big grins every now and then, where like the little part of his brain that's still human pokes through, or maybe he's trying, right? Maybe like he's like, oh, I should smile now, right? That's what people do. And when you talk about comeuppance, like him getting hit by a car, what's interesting is like him getting hit by a car, if he died there, it wouldn't be comeuppance. It would just be bad luck.
Yeah,
you know,
he's
just dead. Like no justice. And that's kind of like that's certainly a theme, is justice. Like nobody gets justice in this. Maybe kind of Llewellyn, but the only thing he does that's like the thing he does that's really wrong is he's willing to put a bunch of other people at risk for himself. But like everybody else that dies is just a victim. And in a way that, yeah, like seems like a victim of chance. Like it seems just unfortunate in a way that, again, like in The Road, the people who are the victims of the slavers are like, they're victims. Like it's awful. It makes you sick. Whereas like Llewellyn dying, you're like, oh man, or not Llewellyn, sorry, Carla Jean dying, you're like, oh man, that stinks. And it's tragic. But again, tornadoes are tragic. And so, yeah, so it's definitely like fate and chance and just like bad luck and yeah, that nihilism of like, yeah, bad things happen. Right. And like in this case, what you have is like Terminator and like Terminator, why is he doing it? Yeah, because it's his job. Why did he take that job? Because it's a job. Like, holy crap, don't you? And like, maybe that's what's so unsatisfying. It's like, don't you have a bigger purpose? Like, you're such a death machine. Don't you like, and you've got this code, he's like a Ronin, right? So he like has no master or whatever. Like, don't you have a purpose? Don't you have something that you kill for? Don't you have a reason? Don't you at least want something? Like the slavers, they want something, right? Like, and that's part of what makes them evil. It's like they're willing to make other people suffer for their own greed or whatever they get out of it. And Chigurh, you're just like, you're like, why are you doing this? Right? And people kind of ask that. They're like, why are you doing this? He's like, well, because I have to. He's like, come on, right? And it just, it's like trying to fight the tide. You just can't. And I think that's what's like, it's certainly unique in storytelling and that unsatisfying part at the end. Because I think when you're watching the movie, maybe this is like, and again, this was after I read the book, and I didn't have any spoilers, so I was like, oh, are they gonna end it in a different way? Nope. Right. So they decided to be true to the ending, which I love, which is just like, you keep expecting at some point there's going to be some justice. There's something's going to happen for a reason, because we humans it's one of the reasons we tell stories is we like making sense of the world. And McCarthy and the Coen brothers are like, no, not going to happen. Stuff happened. Everybody died. Like all the people who are not the badass death machine, killer machine, like if they messed with the badass killer machine, they died. Or actually, no, the only guy coin flip went the right way for was like the gas station owner. Yeah, that guy. Yeah. But everybody else who messed with the death machine, they died. And maybe he got away, maybe he didn't. Doesn't matter. And you almost want to sit McCarthy down and be like, what is your problem? Why would you do this to me? And I've never had a storytelling experience like that before. And that's part of what makes it so great, is that it's like coherent despite being unlike any story that's ever been told. That has ever been told to me.
One of the concerns that some people had about, especially the book, is that it's the Sheriff Bell. He goes, basically, I think it's in between every chapter. There's a section where it's a monologue by the sheriff, and they have a conservative bent to them. Conservative, I would say, in the traditionalist sense. It's not like he's saying vote for this or be against that or etc., but he's pretty much saying something that would be considered quite conservative. And I wonder, do you think that McCarthy is just trying to preach through the sheriff, or is he just trying to show this character, this is who this character is, and this is how he feels, and these are his feelings that get him to the end where he's basically just going to quit because he can't get it all lined up in his head?
Our poor listeners are like, I haven't read the book, man. I haven't watched the movie. What are you doing to me? This isn't beyond the back page. But we here at Beyond the Big Screen strongly encourage you to read the book and watch the movie. They're both brilliant, and just you get a richer experience from having done both. And
especially for this one, I would say, and sometimes skip the book and watch the movie, or sometimes skip the movie and watch the book. But this one, I can't think of anyone of any book movie. This one is absolutely one you've got to do both.
Yeah, I agree. And they, it's and sometimes the book and the movie are just so different. You're kind of like, I don't know, pick what you like. They're just it's not that one's better. It's just different stories. I get the sense that it is probably the case that McCarthy is quite sympathetic to Bell and what Bell thinks. What I really believe is that McCarthy probably saw just the way, the kinds of books that McCarthy writes. McCarthy sees a world in decline. I think if he was an upbeat, optimistic guy, he'd just write different stories. And it tends to be the case that when you see a world in decline, you become traditionalist conservative because you say, well, if it's going the wrong way, it used to be better. If it used to be better, we should do things the way that we did them when they were better. So this is me trying to like put it together live. So do I think he's sympathetic to Bell? Yes. What is, we all have like, turns out we all contain multitudes. It's one of the great things about telling stories is you're like, oh, there's this like shard of me that like, if I let it loose, it would spew this, right? It would tell this monologue. And there's part of me that understands the world is more complex than that. And for someone as smart as McCarthy, it is probably the case, because like Bell's a simple guy. And it's probably the case that McCarthy is a more complex character than Bell. Was like his brain is just more complex than Bell's. But I bet it is the case that McCarthy thinks like, well, look, violence went up for a reason, right? And one of the things that I think he ended up talking about in an interview or something was even, I think he revealed some of his more like old school conservative leaning ideas when he said like, hey, people talk about social problems being the source of violence. He's like, well, social problems have gotten better and violence has gotten worse. So you tell me, right? Something like that. And so I think Bell, I don't know how much Bell is a microphone or is a megaphone for McCarthy, but it's probably not zero.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think too that in a way, I think he maybe wanted Bell to just be Bell. I think that's one thing with Cormac McCarthy's books is as weird it is that he writes the stories. It seems like he gets out of the way and lets the characters speak for themselves, which is, I think that's something that's unique in an author.
Yes. Yeah, it's the only other author I really know who does it like loudly and unapologetically is Stephen King, who's like, yeah, they just like Stephen King is a weird dude. He claims to be a conduit for this stuff. He's like, yeah, they're just going to do what they do, and so they do like weird stuff, and sometimes they're pedophiles, and like I don't know, I'm not endorsing pedophilia, says King, I've only read 2 of McCarthy's books. I've not read Blood Meridian, but I've read a summary of it. I don't know if McCarthy could write we all have limitations on what we can write. I don't know if McCarthy could write a book that is like, I don't know, a full-throated like pro-Chinese Communist Party, hero story, right? Where the individual has to subsume himself to the collective and like is just happier that way, being told what to do, right? And like that's what life should be like. And I don't think that's, I think McCarthy he'd just get stuck. If someone was like, I'll pay you $1 million to write that book, he might just get stuck. Because he's clearly such a believer in the dignity of individualism, not even necessarily its triumph, right? Because like these guys fail. Right? Like these characters fail, but there is like such dignity in charting one's own course for him. And the Coen brothers, I think, really respect that. Respect the dignity of these characters, right? Like you see Llewellyn making bad choices and you get it. You go like, yeah, you could have turned yourself into the cops and like you effed up and you're dead for it. And, I still like you. Still like you, Llewellyn, even though you're a dum-dum. And it's because this is a man who chose to, he made a few bad choices, and then like kind of each time he said, I'm going to try to do things my way, and I'm going to try to use like my faculties and my faculties, my wits, my hard work, and I'm going to try to just I'm going to try to undo my mistakes. And that can be, there are a lot of great tragedies about trying to undo one's mistakes rather than accept one's mistakes. Right, accept the consequences of one's mistakes. But you can see this in the movie just as well. We give Llewellyn, I think we're sympathetic to Llewellyn's desire to do that. We understand it well. And, we think there's at least something somewhat noble in it. And so I do think it reveals a little bit about who McCarthy is, even though I don't know the guy that well.
I think you've really made a case discussing this. I think you could almost say, like, in a way, I know we both really love this movie and love this book, but if you don't go into it with the right frame of mind, you could easily dislike it because it is in a lot of ways unfulfilling in the end, and it doesn't leave you with the traditional story arc of the, if not necessarily the happy ending, an ending where you've learned a moral from.
Right. Or even if you've not learned a moral, that like makes that has something to say, right? Like, because there are endings where the bad guys win, but like sometimes, the bad guys win and it's because the good guys, weren't moral enough, or because, for all sorts of reasons, like for the foibles, for all sorts of foibles, tragedies happen for a reason, man. Right. Like, and you can look at Greek tragedies, and like the reason so many psychological conditions are based on Greek characters is because you're like, oh, this is the fatal flaw, right, of this person that led to this thing happening. And there's something almost just in that, right? Like, oh, this person's greed was their downfall. And in a way, of course, Llewellyn's greed and such were drivers of that. But again, only kinda. And and so that unwillingness of McCarthy to say, clean ending, here's why everything happened, here's why it's okay that things happen the way they did, at least to our main characters, right? Because like almost every violent movie has like collateral damage, but we don't know the collateral damage that happened to people, or we don't know the characters that the collateral damage happens to. But the main characters, things have to happen to them for a reason. They just don't. And he doesn't even discuss that they don't, except through, I guess they do through Belle in the book. But in the movie, we don't, right? In the movie, we don't discuss the fact that things don't happen for a particular reason. We don't discuss Chigurh's, somewhat incoherent code, right? Very firm, but somewhat incoherent, right? It's not obviously based on anything I'm aware of, right? It's not based on some philosophy, right? It's not like he's like a Nietzschean, like going around trying to, do X, Y, Z. It just is. And I can see a lot of people not liking that. And there's part of me that doesn't. But, good stories, if it just felt good, if I just wanted to feel good all the time, I would just watch Pixar films. And there are Pixar films I love. Don't get me wrong. But this movie leaving you unsettled is certainly part of the point. And and unlike almost any other movie that we'll ever talk about, I don't have anything smarter to say about it.